Poštovani gledatelji, u našem serijalu Budućnost Europe čast mi je pozdraviti Wolfganga Koetha sa Europskog instituta za javnu administraciju u Maastrichtu. Mr. Koeth, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much.
So this week we had a citizen panel from the Conference on the Future of Europe in Maastricht. The subject was EU in the world. Can you summarize for us what our citizens said it's important to think about and to act upon in this sphere of subjects very important for our future?
Well, indeed, the citizens discussed the European foreign policy, and I have to say I was impressed because their recommendations were quite ambitious, and they really put the finger on the weak point of the EU, and namely it's the lack of ability to act. So, for example, there were several proposals to get rid of the unanimity requirement in foreign policy. The problem here is that the citizens can only propose, but for this to happen, that means that all the 27 member states have to vote for it by unanimity, and this is unlikely to happen.
But one of these conclusions is something that is very fond of, or was very fond of, from the side of, for example, Paris and Berlin, and that was the subject of, let's say, European army that was put out in the last couple of years, especially from President Macron. Citizens said they wouldn't like to have that.
No, they rejected the proposal to have a European army. However, there was a proposal also arguing in favor for more defense integration. And this is a discussion which is going on right now with the strategic compass. So it can be that some of the proposals some of the more concrete proposals of the participants will be picked up in this discussion.
We'll talk about strategic compass a little bit later. We are having this conversation in, amidst Ukrainian crisis, looking at these things going on. From your perspective as a scholar, what can you say? What is our future in terms of foreign and defense policy?
That's a difficult question because, the EU is still struggling to find its marks on the global scene. And there has been a lot going on over the last years. There has been a significant change in the way also the EU perceives its role here. So a decade ago, the EU saw itself more as a global role model and expected others to follow, trying to lead by example. But this is possible only if you stick to your rules internally. And this is no longer the case, as we have some member states who do not play to these rules. And then it is not reasonable to expect others to play to these rules. And at the same time, we've also seen that there are other countries like Russia and China who are not at all interested to playing by our rules. And we had to react to this. We had to adopt the way we perceive foreign and security policy. Now, the problem is that the EU is not at all equipped for this, because when it comes to foreign and security and defense policy, there are still 27 member states with 27 very different interests. And in foreign and defense policy, almost everything has to be decided by unanimity, meaning that even a small country like, let's say, Malta or Luxembourg, which accounts for 0.1% of the EU population, could block everything. So as long as we have this principle of unanimity, it's difficult to agree on anything meaningful. And this is also the reason why in this present crisis with Ukraine, the EU is basically absent.
Mm-hmm. And talking about unanimity and, the size and the relevance, it's always the subject of conversation within the EU, this inequalities between North and South and East and West, and they're still there. And in this discussion, you've mentioned, of course, Russia and China and their set of values. We are seeing, different approaches to what we know as geopolitics in terms of, moving the world in the cybersphere into hybrid warfare, into, digital influences that are affecting our democracy as we knew it through disinformation and various aspects of digital sides of security and foreign policy. You said we are not still prepared for this. Can we be, and how can we be faster? Because we see that things are changing fast, and we have, big mights as Russia and China surrounding us and influencing us as Europe.
You see, the sad thing is that when it comes to foreign policy, the EU basically only is reacting to crisis and to major crises. And this is quite dramatic. For example, when we look at Ukraine, it's for the first time since the end of World War II that we see a real possibility of one European country directly militarily invading another sovereign country, and the EU is absent here.
Well, it's not the first. We had Yugoslav crisis.
Exactly, and this is where it reminds me personally. I zoom back into December 1991, and I was a young student then, and I remember that I was shocked when I saw live on TV the destruction of the old town of Dubrovnik by Yugoslav artillery. And I was even more shocked when I realized that then already Europe was silent. Nothing came from the EU because the member states were not able to speak with one voice. But then something very interesting happened afterwards. I remember this shellings of Dubrovnik that was on St. Nicholas Day on 6th of December, 1991. 3 days later, on the 9th of December, here in Maastricht, the heads of state and of government met, and they agreed on adopting a common foreign and security policy. And this was certainly no coincidence. And then we fast forward 7.5 years later, the same scenario. In June 1999, the war in Kosovo has ended after a 78 bombing campaign by NATO. And in the same week, the EU agreed on setting up a common security and defense policy, allowing the EU to deploy peacekeeping troops abroad. So you see, when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to defense, it almost systematically needs a major crisis for the EU to take action. And I think maybe here also the Ukraine will work as a catalyst, that the member states will finally, if something happens, agree to take the next step and, for example, get rid of this unanimity requirement in some parts. But I'm afraid it first needs a crisis for this to happen.
Talking about our borders and our foreign and security policy, the issue of migration is the huge issue of our time, of our presence, and of our future. Of course, we have this week EU-African Union summit. We also have unresolved crises in the Middle East still, and open question of Afghanistan after the withdrawal of Western forces. How can we tackle millennial issue and historical issue as migration is?
The migration is a very difficult question for the EU, because it showed us that our values and our interests do not always coincide. It was a sort of a mantra for the EU to say, okay, our values and our interests go hand in hand, and if we promote democracy, the rule of law, human rights across the world, then basically we make the world a better place. And then in 2015, when the migration crisis exploded, we saw that no, it is not always the same. Sometimes we have to put our interests before our values. And I think this is also a reason why the EU has adopted its foreign policy strategy with a global strategy, that we have become more realistic. We now say look at the world as it is and not as we would like it to see. And this reflects in all kinds of policy. This not only in foreign and defense policy, also in trade policy and in others. So we are not longer the idealistic guy holding up global rules, trying to promote global rules, but we climbed down from the mountain and we have become a player on the global field where we defend our interests against our systemic rivals.
Talking about systemic rivalry, it's also an interesting concept. And for the end, you've mentioned at the beginning strategic compass. What do we as a community of nations and states needs to navigate more, and where is that shore? Is it on the horizon?
Well, on the horizon, thing is, a compass normally is something that just shows you the direction, but it doesn't really show you how much more navigation you need. So I think the aim of this strategic compass is to give the Union more common strategic vision and more political steer in the field of security and defense integration, and to streamline all these multiple activities in the field that have been kickstarted after the 2016 Brexit referendum. But there's never been a real political framework and real political commitment, and there's many concepts that remain vague. For example, the vague notion of strategic autonomy. So we never clarified what that means, autonomy from whom, autonomy to do what. Now, you know that in the EU, being vague is sometimes not a bug, but it's a feature. It has some merit because it makes it easier for the member states to agree on something. And so it can be helpful, but only up to a point. And at some point, you have to become more concrete, and you have to really point out what is it what you want to achieve and by which means. And this is exactly what the strategic compass tries now to do, to really point out what is it what we want and how do we want to get there. Now, here, of course, the main problem is the toolbox we have, because we are in the field of security and defense policy. So this is not the internal market where we have binding legislation that the member states have to implement. And if the member states do not implement it, there is a court of justice and you can take legal action. No, it doesn't work like this in defense policy. So this is an exclusive competence of the member states, and all the member states can agree is to do things together in the in the EU framework, but there are no sanctions. So it all depends on trust and political will, and all these have been in short supply over the last years. So
you're not an optimist.
Yes, in the end, we have to, whatever is decided in the strategic compass, it will depend on the political will of the member states to fill it with life.
Waiting for it and keeping our fingers crossed for our, current security. I will leave it with this. Mr. Koeth, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being the guest in our program, Future of Europe. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.